Hello and welcome back to our Better Riding series. We all know that the better we are at something, the more likely we are to enjoy it. And of course, that goes for motorcycling as well. So we've joined forces with Honda Motorcycles UK to create this series of self-help videos, as well as written communication, packed full of tips, advice, simple but useful exercises designed to help motorcycle riders of all experiences and ability to get more from our riding. Of course, that goes for me as well as you guys. So we're providing expert information, practice drills that help increase rider confidence, machine control, and all of that supplements to your traditional post-test training techniques. And to do so, we've teamed up with professional motorbike coach Mark McVeigh, an experienced rider coach, ex-MotoGP engineer, riding academy owner for over 20 years, the inventor of Moto DNA rider training tech. Mark has taught more than 10,000 riders to be smarter, safer, and more confident. Here he is, Mr. McVeigh. Good day.
G'day, Michael. Thanks for the great intro. I had to think a minute. Is that me he's talking about?
How are you,
That's all
sir?
right.
What are we going to talk about today?
Yep. So hazard perception.
Right, well, let's get stuck into it, shall we?
No worries, no worries. So I guess, what is hazard perception? Let's define it. So essentially it's the motorbike rider's ability to read the road and anticipate, upcoming risks. But it's not just about spotting those risks. It's about, predicting them before they kind of materialize. And that proactive approach allows us riders to make timely decisions, and we can adjust our speed and position and direction and reduce our risk. And of course, vision's a big part of good hazard perception. And, we covered that in episode 7 of Better Riding. So you can head to YouTube and check that one out. And then also in the previous Better Riding series was the safety bubble. And that's, part of the motorbike coach riding system. So, helps to minimize your risk and kind of maximize your riding flow.
Sure. So what we'll do then is we'll put the links in the top and also in the description below. So Mark, if hazard perception though is kind of covered in order to get our license, right? Why do we need to think about it?
Yeah, good question. So I mean, some hazard perception theories covered to get your license, but it's kind of rudimentary compared to what you need in the real world. There's only so much you can fit into 20 odd hours of, license training, versus the 10,000 hours that we talk about for, structured practice needed for motorcycle mastery, if you like. But hazard perception, or knowing what risks to look for is primarily developed from experience. And that's the tricky thing.
Wow. So is there do you have any research based on hazard perception?
Yeah, I mean, the research shows, inexperienced riders, they're overrepresented in crash stats, and, they're slower to detect hazards than experienced riders. And that's, kind of obvious. As you get more experience, you learn to understand those potential hazards, through surprises and close calls or worse.
I've got a story, actually, it only happened yesterday, but before I tell you mine, have you got anything to do with any issues, stories about hazard perception?
I've got plenty, but I'll keep it short. We'd need a few hours, but I mean, pretty much nearly 40 years ago, as an 18-year-old on my trusty FZR, I found out the hard way. My inexperience, coupled with a tarmac overband on a dark, wet corner, lost the front and slid almost head on into a car that was coming the other way. But lucky for me, yeah, the driver was super alert. He was on the brakes, and he got his speed right down, so that reduced the kind of speed of the impact. But more importantly, I didn't hit the front of the car. I went into the wheels, the side of the front wheel. And I broke both my legs, but that was really, I could have been easily killed for sure. And essentially, those stories, that's kind of that was the start of motorbikecoach.com, and why we kind of based it on the aviation industry. Super important to train using these kind of common crash scenarios. And, it's kind of a way to hack or fast track your hazard perception ability, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I got you. Just before we move on, I'll tell you mine. It's not quite as dramatic as yours, but I knew we were going to be
I'm
filming this
glad.
today. And it was yesterday morning. I was riding up in Cheshire. I don't really know the area particularly well. It was 7:30, I think it was 7:30 in the morning. It was a fresh, cool day. It wasn't particularly terribly cold. But I was thinking about, recording this and hazard perception. And I was riding along these B roads and I could see sort of low hedges, farmlands. And I thought, well, I can kind of work out using my eyesight, where the road ahead goes. But I started smelling typically farmyard smells or farmyard animal smells, certainly the stuff that comes out the rear end. And yeah, lo and behold, I come round the blind corner and there's a big pile of excrement
Wow.
in the road. But it was just funny how we were, I was thinking about hazard perceptions and about talking to you today. But all of a sudden, I could use, another one of my senses that we didn't normally associate with riding.
Exactly.
Anyway, moving on. What, talk to me, Mark, a little bit more about the sort of the most common crash. I don't want to get too dark on this, but the most common crash scenarios.
Yeah, I know we try not to get dark, but we got to kind of use the data and learn, those aviation principles. We got to learn from what it goes on. And, a way to build your knowledge base is kind of reviewing those, common crash or near miss scenarios. And, if you look at single vehicle crashes in Western countries, roughly half of motorbike crashes are single vehicle. So, the bottom line is the riders are crashing. We're crashing by ourselves with no other vehicle. So
Mm.
think about that for a second, just like me on the wet tar overband 40 years ago.
Wow, yeah. So, but what are the reasons behind all these single vehicle crashes?
Yeah, so if we have a little look at the research, there's plenty of research kicking around. This was a study by Deakin University, and they kind of identified four crash types, that were the most frequent and that caused the most injuries. So the first one was crashes on curves. The next one was head-ons, but not overtaking. And then rear ends and intersection crashes. So if we kind of delve into those, these crash types accounted for kind of over 2/3 of all motorbike casualties, and serious injuries. So that first one, the loss of control on a curve, the research on this is staggering, very sobering. They find that, in single vehicle crashes that were, serious, 64% of those involve loss of control in a corner, in particular in rural areas. So, that's unbelievable. So half of the motorbike crashes are single vehicle, and then 64% of those single vehicles are loss of control in a corner. So it's quite serious. So, but the research, research is often a little bit gray. They talk about inadequate skills or knowledge, or overestimating abilities, or misjudging situations, or too high a speed, which is often the kind of results of these studies.
Look, it was a perfect example then with my experience yesterday morning in a rural environment. Yeah, you're right. It does seem a little bit grey. Have you got any more sort of detail about that? Any more information?
Yeah, well, that the whole idea of why a motorbike coach, what we do is try and get to the root cause of these crashes, so bring in the aviation principles and then use a system to negate the situation. So the bottom line is, when you're surprised or you get a scare, you drop to the level of your training, right? There's no rocket science there. So whether that's entering a corner too fast, or an oncoming car across the white line, gravel in the middle of the corner, all the other things, if you don't kind of practice for those situations, you're not going to be able to react in time when it happens for real. So, if we look at the head-on situation, you can imagine this is the most injurious crash type, and the majority of head-ons, when they're not overtaken, are in the corners, about 80% of them, and typically like that, the car can be across the white line, um, or you can enter the corner too quick and run wide into a car. So there's kind of those two different scenarios.
Yeah. And I bet that you've got some drills, have you? That your riders can practice to build cornering skills and such like.
Absolutely. Practice makes perfect. So, one of the best drills we use is this circle. So you can see Nina, she's coming in, and basically as if you're coming into a corner. And it's great for practicing, vision, your trail braking. You can look at it from this view, you can see coming in. And if we just pause the video there and just kind of explain a little bit, this is kind of the center line is kind of the line to ride, and then the outer and the inner lines are kind of like the boundaries. So it's about roughly a lane width, but it's just so they can practice what it's like in that controlled environment, so you don't get the surprise. And essentially 90% of my students, this was only last week, but 90% of my students, they can't do this drill the first time. It takes lots of practice, to become intuitive. And if we look at this next rail, this is Brad. He's coming in and he's had a couple of runs, and then as normal, you can get a bit uncomfortable, with leaning the bike in. So he's run wide rather than lean the bike. But obviously, then when you practice more and more, you get more comfortable, and eventually, you get the drill becomes kind of intuitive, if that makes sense. And if we go back to Nina, we'll just let this run through, but we've got some data here. So on the left, we've got lean angle. In the middle, we've got G-force, so half a G either way. And then we've got the speed on the right-hand side. And I'll bring this back and play it again. We'll go through it in a little bit more detail. So if we start running through, you can see here Nina's, accelerating. So she's coming in on a steady throttle. So the G-force above the line's acceleration, and this G-force here is essentially like braking. So you can see here, she's practiced this a few times. She'd never done trail braking before, but you can see here, she goes on the brakes, goes down to half a G, and then as she's leaning the bike into the corner, the brake pressure or the longitudinal G reduces until she's basically, on a neutral throttle, and then she uses a neutral throttle for the rest of the turn. So if we play this rail, you'll see as the brake pressure or G-force decreases, you'll see the lean angle increase, and you'll see the speed decrease. So we'll just play that through so you can kind of see. So on the brakes, half a G, letting the brake off, trail, and then onto a neutral throttle. She's got her kind of maximum lean angle there. But you can see, there's nothing dramatic or controversial there. It's just about practicing and getting that feel for the bike. And there's so many benefits of carrying a little bit of front brake with increases the maneuverability of the bike, makes the bike more agile, puts more grip on the front tire. And if something happens mid in the corner, you're kind of already got your hand on the brake, and you're already loaded up the front tire, and the bike's already as agile as it can be. Whereas, traditionally you're kind of accelerating through the corner, whereas the bike's less agile, the weight's off the front tire. If something happens, you got to close the throttle and then go to the brake. And you find that, your speed in the middle of the corner is roughly the same anyway. So it's just one of those drills to, practice makes perfect towards those 10,000 hours.
It's interesting because you say that, exactly. So if you're on the throttle, you need to reach for the brake. Sometimes it's just that split second, that half a second, all it takes for the brain to go, right, you need to get the front brake, and your fingers to do the actual maneuver. It could make all the difference.
Absolutely.
Mark, you talked about rear end crashes a little bit earlier on, but how can we improve hazard perception for something that's coming up behind us?
Exactly. So if we talk about rear ends, there's really a car or something bigger comes into the back of you, when you're stopped at the lights, or often when you're slowing down, and this is kind of like a typical one. And you can see, interesting here, the car on the left was probably more aware than the motorbike rider was, because he was already moving out of the way before the car kind of hit the car, or sorry, the car hit the bike. But, things like line filtering, between cars. So, don't be the meat in a car sandwich. You don't want to be between, the two vehicles. So having that situational awareness around that. Also, I see a lot of times, riders kind of like braking too hard. So, there's maybe a big gap to the car, the traffic in front, and they're, on the brakes too hard, and the car behind hasn't kind of realized, and then they go into the back. But it's kind of, you need to have eyes in the back of your head these days, good situational awareness, mirrors, lifesavers, just so you've that 360 awareness. That's the kind of key thing. And yeah, and then the last one on the list was intersections. So, car coming out in front of the motorbike, and that's the leading cause of motorbike crashes involving other vehicles. There's a lot of studies around MAIDs, MAID, motorcycle accidents in depth. That's a good one. They've kind of found it's half of motorbike accidents are at intersections. And obviously we've got a small visual profile makes the bike, harder to see than a car. So, this one's typical. There's a car, and then they haven't seen the bike. They've failed to see us, and they've failed to yield. So, we've got to compensate by riding defensively and just being like hyper aware, adjust your speed and your safety bubble. Don't trust the driver's eyes. That was one that we talked about in the vision drill. Only trust the car's wheels. Are they moving, and what direction are they in? And then having some awareness about, motion camouflage. So having some lateral movement in your lane, that can be beneficial too, just to give you an extra edge. If you're coming up to a junction, you're going, oh, what's this driver doing? You're a bit nervous. I mean, if you're nervous, go to the brakes. That's the key thing. Always go to the brakes. And, but that little bit of lateral movement can help, reduce that risk a little bit.
Yeah, prime example. Again, yesterday I'm on the motorway. It's 3 lanes. I'm in lane 3. I'm doing 65 behind a car in the outside lane, and I'm keen to make a bit of progress. And they're in the outside lane. There's nothing in 2 or 1.
Yeah.
But what I've done is I've sort of started moving around in my lane. I've obviously maintained the perfect gap, but I've moved around in the lane. So in their rearview mirror, they can see this light, and of course it works, doesn't it? But Mark,
It does.
What are these other tools? Are there any other tools that we can use to improve our hazard perception?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, knowledge is power, right? That's one of the sort of key things that we use in Motorbike Coach. And we've got this 3-pillar system. So if you think about, your skill, that's your ability to control a machine. How closely can you, in a car park, demonstrate, the how close you are to the grip, the limit of the tire. Now, you're not going to use that out in the road, but you've got the skill in your back pocket if you need to use it. And then the craft is really about, that road craft, the hazard perception. And then we've got another one, mind, which is, attitude, understanding cognitive bias, knowledge is power. And you kind of need to practice and develop, the machine control skills, but in conjunction with the hazard perception, which is the part of the road craft that, will help you plan your ride and reduce those surprises in the first place. That's kind of the idea behind it.
Mark, we talked a little earlier about reaction time, about not covering the brake, but sort of that time, that reaction time, it could, like we said, it could make all the difference. But how have you got any more information or advice on how that can affect hazard perception?
Yeah, well, I guess if you think about the mind part of the 3 pillars, understanding about there's a perception time and a reaction time. So the perception reaction time is the total time from when the hazard appears to when the rider begins to take action. So like braking or swerving. So if you break it down, the perception time is the amount of time it takes a rider to recognize the hazard, and that can be typically around a second. And then there's another second for reaction time, and that's the time to physically initiate the response, like moving your hand to the brake. So that's 2 seconds. So if you kind of add those up, that's, if you're doing 100 kilometers an hour, 60 miles an hour, that's 28 meters or 90 feet in 1 second. So multiply that by the 2 seconds, and you've got 55 meters or 180 feet before the riders actually adjusted their speed in response to hazard. So we've got a good video here, and you can say, the rider's good safety bubble, moving into the right position. And then if we kind of freeze the video here, and we'll point out, you can see this sign in the distance, right? So there's a sign there. So that sign is 180 feet or 2 seconds away. So a typical rider, if you had something that pull out there, an animal, a cow, whatever, a junction, the rider will get there, and they haven't even started to slow down. Boom. So that kind of
Two
puts it in.
seconds.
That's 2 seconds. Yeah. So that kind of puts it into perspective, right? Yeah, 2 seconds, and that's the average. To be honest, I think it's worse these days than a second from what I see on the road. People are so distracted. But anyway, that's kind of what the road safety people use. But you spoke before about, you were thinking about this video, and that's kind of mindfulness, and that's a really important thing, so mental rehearsals, that's kind of a great way to be ready for hazards, visualizing, different scenarios and how you would react, and you're kind of building that mental agility to help make that sort of hazard perception and response like second nature and intuitive.
Interesting stuff. Mark, I feel like we're running out of time a little bit, and we've got so much more to talk about. But of course, there are plenty more episodes to come. And you touched a little bit earlier about braking. I think we've got a braking episode coming up soon. But anyway, before we close this one, what are the biggest hazards? What is the biggest hazard for riders?
Okay, yeah, this could be a bit controversial, but the third pillar that we talk about in the motorbike coach system, I mentioned, is mind, right? So our attitude, understanding cognitive bias, our appetite to learn, to progress from that 20 hours of, training for your license towards 10,000 hours for mastery. So, but when you look at the data, especially the loss of control in corner, the statistics are staggering, right? So, you could say that the biggest hazard to be aware of is ourselves, the riders, right?
Oh, the stats don't lie, do they? But that's also why we're here, to try and, bring a little bit more information, advice, technique, and understanding of how a bike works, how our mind works.
Exactly.
So,
We've
yeah,
got to
really-
talk about it.
Mark, thank you.
All
Good to
right.
see you as always.
Thanks, Michael.
We'll see you next time. I'll close out.
Well, Mark and I will be back next time to discuss, as we mentioned, how to use your brakes, and specifically not just for slowing down. But anyway, in the meantime, don't forget to check out all the other episodes of our Better Riding series. Thank you once again to Honda Motorcycles for supporting this. Come and find us at Bennett's Bike Club. It's our new community website, a bit like a forum. We have a Facebook group called Bennett's Bike Social. Or if you become a Bike Social member, you can make the most of over 200 different motorcycling discounts and offers. It's free if you insure your bike directly with Bennett's, or you can sign up for just £6 a month or £60 a year. Thanks again. We look forward to reading and replying to your comments down below, and we'll see you next time.
Honda Motorcycles are supporting this series because safety is one of their key business pillars, and their quest for safety inspires their innovations in products, technology and education, which is why they're committed to achieving zero traffic fatalities involving Honda mobility products worldwide by 2050.